This is a man's world. This is a man's world. But it wouldn't be nothing, nothing without a woman or a girl.
Hello, and welcome back to episode 2 of It's a Man's World, the Genesis 3:16 effect. I am your host, Haley Rose, and I am joined by Rachel Darnall.
Hi, Haley. It's great to be here.
Good to have you back. In this episode, we're going to show one of the darker aspects of gender hierarchy, which is the way that men shift blame to maintain their personal purity at women's expense.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about the history of the witch trope as a way to sort of get our heads around this concept and also a way to show just how far this can go. I think we tend to think of witches as sort of lighthearted and funny. We're coming up on Halloween as we're recording this, so we're seeing people dressing up as witches. They're watching Hocus Pocus. But unfortunately, we are not talking about the fun witch stuff today. I know that some of our viewers may be parents with young children. Normally, we try to keep it PG, but this is one to maybe listen to when the kids are not around.
We also want to be very considerate, as many of our listeners are experiencing the fallout of trauma. So it's important to be emotionally present and aware of your own capacity for listening to hard things. We're going to be discussing religious misogyny, sexual assault, and generally violence against women. So take a moment, take a few easy breaths if need be, and consider what you need if you're still with us. Rachel, where did we leave off?
Yeah, in episode 1, we were talking about Genesis 3:16 and the woman's desire and her desire as this idolatrous dependence towards the man that is going to lead into gender hierarchy. And we see gender hierarchy at work almost right away in Genesis 3. Because one of the primary reasons why you do not want to be on the bottom of an earthly hierarchy is because blame falls to the bottom. Blame does not rise to the top, it falls to the bottom in earthly hierarchies. So Adam and Eve have just eaten the fruit, they have disobeyed the command, and they experience shame for the first time. And Adam's first instinct when he feels this shame is to offload blame onto Eve. In Genesis 3:12, Adam creates this counter narrative where evil has come into the world because there's something dysfunctional about the woman. Notice in Genesis 3:12, he says to God, "It was the woman who you gave to be with me." So it's almost like he is going to Best Buy and returning a defective product. As we'll see throughout this episode, Genesis 3:12 sets up this interpretive tradition that is going to reverberate throughout Christian history and really throughout human history. It's this idea that the woman is not to be trusted because her desires are fundamentally disordered because she is female. She's inclined towards evil, and the man has to either rescue her from herself or be dragged down with her. And there's a certain plausibility to that idea because human desires are disordered by the fall. We saw in episode 1 that sin changes the human orientation away from God. And if you're looking for sin in women, you're going to find it. But Eve did not fall into sin because she was female. She fell into sin because she was human and she was temptable. And Adam demonstrates that he also is human and temptable. He is able to fall. Haley, people really never stopped doing this, have they? And I know that you have some tools for helping us understand psychologically what's going on behind the scenes when people create these kinds of blame narratives.
Yeah, when I think of a way to understand how some of these dynamics work, I always really think of the Cartman drama triangle. And this is something that was developed out of transactional analysis, which was Eric Burns' psychoanalytic theory. And then Stephen Cartman developed the drama triangle in the 1960s. This is something that we can use to understand what's happening when emotions are intense, but they get kind of confusing. So the first thing that we need to define is drama. And these are emotionally intense experiences that aren't actually real. They're very dramatic, but it's not the psychological reality. We can think of this like somebody who's on stage, they're acting, they're doing Shakespeare on stage, and maybe they're giving you one sort of emotional experience, but in reality, they might be nervous or scared or sick or tired. So what they're experiencing inside of their body is different from what they're displaying to you. And the payoff in that example is that, well, you're getting a show. And so you want to experience the emotion that they're giving to you. But when it is real life, the payoff that somebody gets is that they get to offload their shame onto somebody else. It's an emotional outcome that you unconsciously seek. So in this drama triangle, we have 3 points. We have a persecutor who criticizes, blames, controls, acts superior, and enforces strict rules. We have a rescuer who offers unsolicited advice and uses guilt to keep victims dependent. And sometimes they even feel guilty if they're not helping. And then we have a victim who feels oppressed, powerless, and hopeless.
That makes a lot of sense to me, Haley. It seems like it really does fit the situation with Adam and Eve. Can you talk us through how the Cartman triangle would map onto this scenario in Genesis 3?
In the beginning of this, Adam and Eve were in the garden and they were sinless. And then Eve ate the fruit first, and then Adam ate the fruit, and then God came to them. And Adam said, "That woman," which is casting her as a persecutor. And then he says, "that you gave to me," which is actually moving God over to the persecutor role and putting Adam in the victim role, and kind of insinuating that God needs to rescue Adam from Eve, but it's also kind of his fault. That's one of the hallmarks of this drama triangle, that the roles shift very quickly and they can shift in the course of a single sentence.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how fast that switch happens.
Yeah. There's a really interesting clip of that came from the Atlantic, and it's of men who are in a domestic violence offender group. These are men who are court ordered to go to groups so that they can stop committing domestic violence against women or against any of the people in their lives. So take a look at this video.
Okay, Grant, introduce yourself to them and tell them what you did to get yourself here.
Well, I'm in a little bit of a trickier situation in the sense that I didn't actually do anything physically violent except break the grip that my mother had on my daughter, her grandchild, because she was dragging my child along to the point where I thought she was going to pull her arm out of her socket. I remember seeing red and repressing every urge to just throw a haymaker and knock her out, because when you hear your child crying in pain and you're watching that person hurt that child, you don't want to let them keep doing it. She called the cops because, once again, she was drunk, and she sent me to jail saying I had assaulted her. I showed the officers where she'd scratched me, and they said, well, since you have a restraining order, we're just going to take you.
Let me clarify about what we do in group.
Yeah.
So our group is only for you.
Right.
So in here, we're only going to talk about Grant. We can't talk about mom. We're not going to talk about dad. We're not going to talk about ex-wife because they're not here and I can't help them. I can only help you.
I don't expect you to help them.
Okay. So the legal part of what happened is you violated the restraining order by not having peaceful contact when you grabbed her hand and then you slapped her, which is assault. So that's the part we want to focus on at the beginning.
Okay.
So it sounds like what you were saying earlier is it's not that you don't like yourself, but you don't like what you've learned.
Yeah.
Okay. But the good thing about what you're going to discover about
Yeah.
this class is we're going to give you the tools that you didn't get when you were growing up. Okay, who else has questions for Grant? We got to
I don't have a question, but, Grant, we're all here because of some form of craziness in our behavior. and you're going to have a ton of information just thrown at you, like it already has happened. And the sooner you just jump in, a sink or swim type of issue, the sooner you're going to kind of get it and maybe absorb it and take from it what you can. We're not here against you. We're here with you because of our behavior. And we're all here because we want to improve it. So the sooner you can just jump in and swim, the sooner you're going to get it. So all these outside circumstances, because we all have them, father's gone, stepmother, whoever's, whatever, that stuff doesn't really matter. You're here because of you, and you're here because you want to improve yourself, and we're here to kind of help you do that. So the sooner you just give up, in a sense, the sooner you'll get a bit of it.
Obviously, it's court-mandated treatment, so you didn't decide on your own that you need to be here. But that's the typical hard part, that people have to get over that hurdle. And like you were saying, the faster you get to that place, the quicker you're going to absorb all kinds of great tools that we're going to teach you. Any other questions for Grant? No. So what I want you to do this week is I want you to find your 3 physiological warning signs that tell you you're about to lose it. So what you're going to do is you're going to start to use your body as your first line of defense. Any thoughts? All right, you guys have a good week. Behave yourselves.
Wow. So many of these men go on to reoffend. And as we saw in that clip, that man was still extremely angry. He was not taking responsibility. He was still shifting blame onto his own mother and saying, who was drunk, by the way. There are all these little tells in his behavior that the other men in the room were actually picking up on because they knew what they were seeing. And it was making very clear that he did not feel responsible in that moment for his actions. It's very grim.
Yeah, and it's interesting how this narrative that he creates allows him to go on and be a repeat offender, because it creates a narrative that is self-justifying. And if you feel like you're in the right, if you're able to convince yourself of that, there's no reason to not go ahead and just do it again.
Exactly.
You see, man made the car.
Witch hunting, it's kind of the ultimate scapegoating drama, isn't it?
It really is, because it is a very emotionally charged event that allows people to escape from the complexities of real life.
Yeah, and I think most people, when they think about witch hunts, they think of the Salem witch trials.
Yeah, in America, that's certainly what we think of with witch trials. And the Puritans are a great example of this kind of escapism with the witch trials. The American Puritans believed that they were entering into a national covenant with God in the New World. So in this paradigm, purity is very important, and the community's purity is very important, because you don't get the covenant blessings as an individual, you get them as a community. So at the time of the Salem witch trials, the American Puritans were already a few generations into this national covenant plan. And there was beginning to be a sense that the apple had sort of fallen far from the tree. The older generation was beginning to feel like, oh, kids these days, they don't care about morality like they did in my day. The generational dynamics really never change. They're the same now as they were then. So you have this dynamic where people feel like society needs to be reformed, but they're not really ready to deal with the complexities of true repentance or real reform. And they prefer this drama where Satan is sending witches to attack them, and they need to rescue the community by destroying the witches. And the Puritans are kind of here for this drama because this is a very austere culture. That's what the Puritans were all about, plain clothes, just this very drab lifestyle. So it's much more appealing for them to tune into this daily drama of the witch trials, which was in a way pretty entertaining, rather than deal with the real issues at hand in Salem.
Well, that reminds me so much of Christian nationalism in the American church today. And they also happen to believe in Christian patriarchy. They're so concerned with purity. And somehow it's always women who end up being their targets. And they're so dramatic about it. I mean, recently, Joel Webben called for the public execution of Me Too accusers, only the ones who are lying, apparently. But he doesn't want actual rapists to be murdered. That's being very dramatic. John MacArthur at Grace Community Church, they're so passionate and into church discipline, but there's such a drama to the procedure. It's this big public event. Eileen Gray was excommunicated because she wouldn't reconcile with her husband, who is a convicted batterer and child.
Yeah, and these are scenarios where women are actually asking for things that are very reasonable. They want men to be held accountable for their actions. They want protection from male violence. And the response to that is that the blame gets projected onto them and they become demonized instead.
So if we go back to Salem, rewinding back to the past, 20 people were executed, but 6 of them were men. And a lot of the accusers were women. So it doesn't seem like this is a case of just outright misogyny. Maybe it's just mass hysteria.
Yeah, there are a lot of historical analysts that sort of ignore the elephant in the room when it comes to the witch trials, especially Salem, because there were a lot of other factors in play. But we have to remember that Salem didn't happen out of the blue. It happened in a certain historical context. The Puritans did not invent witch hunting. They inherited witch hunting from Europe. Witch hunts had already been going on in Europe for 2 centuries by the time that Salem happened. They were happening in Germany, in Switzerland, in England, in Scotland, in France. And the Salem trials were actually fairly mild compared to some of the European witch hunts, as we will see in a little bit. Long story short, the witch trials are a much bigger story than Salem. As far as numbers go, it's controversial. It's difficult to know exactly what the numbers were, but a good, fairly conservative estimate is probably about 100,000 people executed during the height of the witch craze, and 85% of those were women. So we're talking about numbers that are equivalent to a major war during this period. So yes, there is religious fanaticism and there's mass hysteria. Those are all factors, but that is not mutually exclusive with misogyny. All of those things can play together.
So how do they play together?
So this is the Reformation era, right? And there is a heightened awareness and a heightened defensiveness about moral and doctrinal purity. And there were real problems in the Catholic Church leading up to the Reformation. One of the big issues was corruption in the clergy. After the Black Death in the 14th century, the church had been able to accumulate massive amounts of land from people who died of the plague. So they had these resources to hand out, and that meant that the people who were attracted to being in these church offices were not necessarily there for good reasons. A lot of them were ambitious. They were just using the priesthood as a way to social climb. And they certainly had no intention of keeping those vows of celibacy that they took. And this is a very open secret. Protestants and Catholics are aware of it, and they agree that the clergy needs to be reformed and really that society needs to be reformed. But the men who are leading the charge on all of this sexual immorality and corruption are not easy to hold accountable because they're people who have church positions. They're people with institutional power. So as the Reformation goes on, it just becomes much easier to reform society by going after women. And one of the ways that that happens is the criminalization of certain sexual behaviors that were certainly frowned upon before, but they were not criminalized, like prostitution and out of wedlock pregnancy. Those become criminal offenses, and the people who are getting punished for those crimes are mostly women, just because it is easier to catch and punish women for sexual crimes because women become pregnant. But reforming society by punishing women also takes the form of the witch trials. You can see from this graph in The Economist that witch trials and witch executions are definitely on the rise with the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. In her book, Witch Craze, A New History of the European Witch Hunts, historian Anne Llewellyn Barstow says this: among the possible meanings of a woman's life in early modern Europe, the most shocking was that she could stand for all that was utterly evil. By nature, because she was female, she was eligible for this role, and the meaning of this identification, strange to say, was that certain women served an important function as symbols of all that the society claimed it was not. The woman is being assigned a role to play in this social drama, and it's the role that nobody wants. It's the society is saying everything that we're ashamed of, everything that we're embarrassed about in our culture, we're going to project that onto you, and we're going to say that we have expelled this element from our culture by destroying you. The witchcraft trials become a way for Catholics and Protestants to put on this big dramatic display that is supposed to demonstrate how seriously they take sin and Satan. This actually becomes almost a competition. It's a recruiting tool for both the Protestants and the Catholics to show everyone we're the church you should join because we take this stuff so seriously.
How does all of this church drama fit onto this triangle?
So we have the persecutors who are actually these corrupt clergy in the Catholic Church. Everybody agrees, everybody knows that they are a corrupting influence on society. But the narrative shifts to blaming women instead, because that's just an easier thing to do. So instead of going after the corrupt clergy, which is hard, they go after women, which is easy. We know from the very start that the European witch hunters were targeting women, and they were aware that they were targeting women, and they had a religious rationale for doing that. In 1486, Pope Innocent VIII commissioned the Malleus Maleficarum. He had two priests write this book that was basically a guidebook for witch hunting. And its authors are trying to answer the question, why is it that so many more women are witches than men? And it never occurred to them to say, why are we discriminating against women? Why are we targeting women? They instead asked this question, why is it that women are witches instead of men? Because that must be what it is. So here is how the witch hunters, the witch hunting pros at the end of the 15th century were answering that question. Quote, since they, women, are feebler both in mind and body, it is not surprising that they should come more under the spell of witchcraft. So first of all, before we even address what they actually say there, it demonstrates that they were very aware that they were targeting women. Even if historians today have a hard time admitting that, at the time, the men doing this knew what they were doing.
Oh, yeah. They completely knew what they were doing. They wrote a whole book about it. So they went for women's bodies are a little bit weaker than men, to their minds are weaker, to they're just witches.
Mm-hmm. And this is so typical of the patriarchal mindset to make that shift. Like we were talking about earlier, it happens so fast where first it's chivalry and we need to protect women because they're weak and they're vulnerable and maybe a little bit gullible and silly, but that just means that we need to protect them. But then the shift so quickly becomes, oh, actually, they're dangerous and we need to get them before they get us. And there are some really dangerous theological implications to what the authors of Malleus are saying here. they actually say that God made a mistake when he made women. It should be noted that there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from a bent rib. And since through this defect, she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives.
Well, there's that triangle again. Blaming women becomes a way to blame God. This still happens today. I mean, I go back to my old friend Debbie Pearl in Created to Be His Helpmeet. She says, I picture the man as being heavily armored. His armor is helpful both spiritually and physically. God loaded him down with resistance, giving him a nature that is doubtful, skeptical, forceful, and pushy. As a general rule, man is ruled more by his mind than the female, who is governed more by her sensibilities. The next quote that we have here, I won't put it up, but I'll read it. She says, picture God. I love how she's speaking for God here, as deliberately creating woman without this armor, because he intended for her to stand behind her husband's armor. That is not in the Bible.
Yeah, it's nuts because she is implicating God in men's desire to keep women artificially vulnerable. Like women are actually vulnerable in relation to men, but men like to keep women artificially vulnerable to feel good about themselves. And Debbie Pearl is projecting that onto God, which is just so presumptuous. But
Yeah.
I want to say, too, that Created to Be His Helpmeet was published in 2004. So we're not talking about ancient history anymore. This is still going on today. People still say this stuff.
Absolutely. Check your bookshelves of your nearest friend and see if they have this book there, because it's alive and well.
Yes.
Sexuality is this area where people really do tend to feel a lot of shame. And what sucks for women is that when men feel shame about sex, women end up suffering.
Yeah, and we see an example of that, like with the Billy Graham rule that all of the Theo Bro guys are excited about. It's this idea that men can protect themselves by just keeping their distance from women. But that can actually harm women in some cases, that mentality.
That makes me think of like in Japan, there's a culture of like going and having a drink after work and having like some meat skewers. And it's sort of like no women allowed. It's really patriarchal culture. And the problem is a lot of women get, if they are in the workplace, they get missed with all of like the work talk that actually happens in these places because it's kind of like no girls allowed. So women's careers can suffer because of this no girls allowed thing. So it's not just America and the Billy Graham rule and the Western world. Like patriarchy is kind of a problem everywhere for women.
Zachary Wagner talks about the Billy Graham rule in his book, Non-Toxic Masculinity, Recovering Healthy Male Sexuality. And he says, added together, these regulations communicate that women are a threat. We should not be surprised when this posture of fear, antagonism, and dehumanization translates into abusive behavior. And that is definitely proved true with the witch hunts, because sexual shame is a major part of the construction of the witch trope. So in both the medieval and the Hellenistic world, it was considered to be like common knowledge that women are oversexed. They're just sexually insatiable. And you can see that all over Malleus. This is a quote. It says, she is more carnal than a man, as is clear from her many carnal abominations. According to Malleus, witches were women who had been seduced by the devil. They were supposed to have intercourse with demons and have demon babies and go off to wild orgies on their broomsticks. They allegedly had extra breasts that they grew to like feed their demon babies. So at the end of the 15th century and forward, you are seeing the whole concept of a witch become a very sexually charged idea. And it's an idea that revolves around female sexuality specifically.
Yeah, this is just projection. I mean, this might have been a long time ago, But we're still just talking about humans, like humans today, like you and me walking around. And we all know this. Women are generally not oversexed and reaching after men constantly. Older women definitely are not oversexed and reaching after men constantly. And you know what? Childbirth was incredibly dangerous back then. So there's even less of an incentive to just have sex all the time because it was a different world. But men, young men, old men, they are generally the ones who are oversexed and aggressive even as they age. We do not generally have, nor have we ever. I have never seen the evidence of scandals of women writ large, raining sexual scandals down on men. All of that is just projection.
Yeah, it is definitely projection. And we kind of have the opposite idea now in our culture. We believe that men are sexually insatiable, women never want it. But it's amazing how quickly this idea can come back when it needs to in order to blame a woman.
Yeah, I always think about James Dobson. He was in a car and he has this quote in a book. He says, "When I was on the way home, a very attractive girl drove up beside me in her car and smiled. She was obviously flirting with me. Then she slowed down, looked back, and turned onto a side street. I know she was inviting me to follow her. I didn't take the bait." Yeah, that's not what happened, James Dobson. You were just driving and you pulled up next to somebody else who smiled at you, and then she drove down another road. And you want to say that you were the victim of her smiling at you and you didn't take the bait? He has no idea. And he is projecting almost a crime on this presumably real woman. I have questions about whether this actually happened, but he is not the victim of a smiling woman. He is actually the persecutor of telling a story about a woman who really did nothing to him. That is the reality.
Yeah, and it like what was he gonna do? What would it look like for him to take the bait? Was he going to like follow her to her house and wait till she got out of her car in her driveway and say, "Let's go"? Like
I know you were
he would
tempting
have
me.
been like a criminal in
Yeah.
that situation.
And then what is he going to tell the police? She smiled at me. That's not how driving
that's
works.
not gonna work, bro.
So they said that it was women who were doing all of the sexy stuff at all of the men. Were people Did they say anything about this? Were they upset about it? Did they fight about it?
They weren't really saying anything that hadn't been said before. They were working off of existing values that came from Hellenistic beliefs about men and women. And these Hellenistic beliefs had sort of been, they slid into Christianity through certain key influencers. And these values about women were connected to certain theological ideas about sex. We can thank Augustine for this lovely little concept called concupiscence, which was a major factor in how medieval people thought about sex.
Yeah, I had to look this word up. And the dictionary says that concupiscence means strong desire, especially sexual desire.
Yeah, that's a good place to start, but we have to understand that in Augustine's writing, concupiscence is this whole very specific theory about sin. Sin involves inordinate desires that take control of a person. So you are supposed to be in control of your desires rather than your desires being in control of you. And Augustine thought that sex was a big part of this. He believed that sexual arousal was a result of the fall. So before the fall, he thought sexual arousal just didn't happen.
So that's really hard because we're all grown-ups here and we all know that sexual arousal has to happen in order to do that certain thing. What did he think they were doing before the fall if they were to have sex?
Yeah, he has an answer for this. He basically believes that before the fall, what the male body needs to do to impregnate the female body would happen just by a sheer act of will. So it would not involve the man being like impacted from the outside by the woman. It would not involve this spontaneous arousal that felt to him like not being in control. The 17th century poet Milton dramatizes Augustine's idea of concupiscence in his big epic poem Paradise Lost. Basically, Adam and Eve fall into sin, and immediately afterwards, their eyes are opened. And his interpretation of their eyes being opened is Adam experiences lust. For Eve, they have sex and then they're ashamed, and that's why they cover themselves up. So you have this idea that sex almost is the original sin.
Yeah, and again, the Bible doesn't say that. We're not turning sin or framing sin as like, don't lust after somebody else's wife. Augustine and presumably Milton are saying that the feelings that your own wife arouses within you are shameful and humiliating because there's a powerlessness to it. And I can imagine that if you're a boy going through puberty and you look at a pretty girl and everybody knows that you looked at the pretty girl, okay, that could feel shameful and it might even feel like magic. And so when boys are shamed by youth group leaders or purity culture, that actually makes it dangerous for women because of the scapegoating and blame shifting dynamic. And I think about the spa shooting in Atlanta some time ago, back in 2021. Robert Long, age 21, he entered a spa and murdered 7 women and 1 man. And he said that he had a sex addiction and that he was eliminating temptation.
And that is such a shocking modern example of how far this dynamic can go. But it's based on ideas that have a long pedigree. In the Hellenistic world, women were associated with sex in a way that men weren't, because women were associated with the body in a way that men were not. Basically, the Hellenists saw the universe in terms of matter and spirit. So male was associated with spirit and activity and the mind and rationality, and the female was associated with matter and the body and the flesh and like the baser appetites. So the appetite for food or sex or anything that the body desires was associated with women. And they have all these lofty ways of talking about this, but what it really comes down to is everything about being human that they're ashamed of, they're projecting that onto women so that they don't have to be identified with it. We already saw that in episode 1 with weakness and vulnerability, that men like to compare themselves to women to feel strong in comparison. And this is just another step of projecting everything that men don't want to admit is part of who they are as humans and saying, no, that just applies to women. Some of the early church fathers try to synchronize Christianity with Hellenistic values about the world and about gender. And the way that this works out is they interpret the fall as being Eve's fault. So Tertullian, in his pamphlet on the apparel of woman, says to women, "And do you not know that you are each an Eve? You are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him who the devil was not valiant enough to attack." So Tertullian there is standing firmly in the tradition that Adam started in Genesis 3:12 of blaming the woman and saying, it's not my fault. It was the woman you gave me. There's something defective about the way she was made, and that's why I sinned.
Oh, yeah, that's a payoff. Men get to feel good about themselves by taking the shame that is very painful to feel, offloading it onto somebody else. They feel shame over natural and good sexuality, shame over human weakness, shame over the fall itself.
You see, man made the car.
So how did it get to this point where women are now being publicly executed for witchcraft? Because I know that Augustine and Tertullian were not alive when they were doing this. It started later. What happened?
There were a lot of factors that went into it. One of the factors is that this is a period of intense religious conflict. So the Catholics are persecuting the Protestants are persecuting the Catholics. They're both persecuting Anabaptists and Jews and just anybody else that did not fit the mold. And there's this feeling that heretics need to be punished in these very dramatic and public ways. They need to be made an example of because the purity of the church and the purity of its people is at stake. There's almost an expectation in the church that the church is going to have to be purged periodically. And when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And that's where the witch trials come in because there's a need to feed this sentiment that we need to purge the church, we need to purge evil. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII, who we talked about earlier, who commissioned the Malleus Maleficarum, issued a papal bull that officially made witchcraft the same as heresy. It was considered a type of heresy. So in that papal bull, he says this: "It has come to our attention, not without bitter sorrow, that many persons of both sexes, unmindful of their own salvation and deviating from the Catholic faith, have abused themselves with devils, and by incantations, spells, conjurations, and other accursed superstitions and horrid charms, destroy the offspring of women and the young of the cattle, blast and eradicate the fruits of the earth, the grapes of the vine, and the fruits of the trees."
Oh no, it's giving they're eating the dogs.
Yes, it's really a similar kind of dynamic. It's the same old tropes, the same playbook that people always pull out when they are trying to demonize a vulnerable group, including when the Roman Empire was trying to demonize early Christians. Nigel Cawthorne says in his book, Witch Hunt: History of a Persecution, many of the fiendish things that witches are supposed to do were also ascribed to the early Christians. So the people persecuting the early Christians were saying that they were having these weird sex orgies, that they would kill and eat babies. All the same things that we associate with witchcraft or like today, Satanism, like the satanic panic scare of the 80s and 90s. Those things just keep on repeating themselves.
Yeah, and if this was being applied to the early church, then it does seem like Christians should have known better.
They definitely should have known better at this point. They had been on the receiving end of that. But anyway, the Pope in this papal bull basically says that inquisitors, which were like the doctrine police, should be empowered to stop these crazy baby killing people by any means necessary. And by this point, by any means necessary would have been understood to include torture and interrogation and burning at stake if you were convicted.
And okay, there probably were crops dying, there probably was cattle dying, and I'm sure people were getting sick. That always happens. That's how life is. It doesn't mean that there's a conspiracy led by people who have magic. We Christians have the Bible. You know you live in a fallen world. You know that bad things happen and you know that there are a lot of different reasons. And the Bible didn't say it's all because of witches.
And the Bible didn't say that it's all because of women. So another logistical thing that is happening leading up to the period of the witch trials is that the European legal structure is going through a shift around the 12th century to a more centralized form of government. In that book, Witch Craze by Anne Llewellyn Barstow, she says, medieval Europe had originally practiced restitutive justice, a form of community customary law that functioned through arbitration with the goal of reconciliation. Because the objective was the restoration of communal peace, it was not advantageous to wipe out one's enemies or to inflict long-term punishment on them.
Well, that's pretty amazing. What she's calling restitutive justice. It sounds a lot like what we teach at the Anastasis Center under the name restorative justice. And that's about restoring the victim back to health, back to wholeness, and having the offender participate in making things right. one of the goals is for that relationship to experience restoration.
Yes, and that is exactly what you don't see in the witch trials at all. They're not trying to repair anything. Their feeling is, we're going to purge evil by purging people.
Hey, everybody, breaking in from the editing room here. I think some people might be asking, why is the Anastasis Center doing this video series? And I thought it might be important to bring in our director, Mako Nagasawa, to explain how important we think this series is. Welcome, Mako.
Thanks, Haley. Good to see you. And thanks for this work that you and Rachel are doing.
Yeah.
So really quickly, there are 3 reasons why it's really important for us at the Anastasis Center to do this series, It's a Man's World. And specifically, I want to comment on this particular episode, Burn the Witch. There are 3 reasons why we care. Number 1, because we care about women and women's issues in the framework of an egalitarian position. So we believe in the full equality of men and women in marriage and in church leadership. We think that God began the original creation with full equality in mind, and that Jesus restores that vision in his new creation. And he helps us to resume that path. And there are a lot of details that need to be worked out. And it's not just as simple as saying, well, we believe this. So if you have seen our, Reconstruction, Deep Roots of Early Christian Theology videos or plantation capitalism videos, you know that we come at this question from different angles. And this is just a fuller explanation for what we think the ramifications are to be egalitarian. Secondly, it's because we care about restorative justice. That's part of our mission, that we believe God's justice is restorative and not retributive. And in this video, you commented, Haley, on the shift in European history from restorative justice to retributive justice because of scholarly developments focused on like how the old Roman Empire used to work. That is a big concern, and we carry that concern forward to the Protestant Reformation and to today, because we think the Protestant reformers were not just like denominational leaders in the same way that we think of denominations today. They were regime builders. And when you build a regime, you have to answer the question, what gives you the right to punish people? They said God's justice is retributive, and that's why we punish people retributively. And you could see, for example, like as the Protestant Reformation spread, incarceration went up and things like this. So in response, we produce bread and butter Bible studies and evangelism tools that take the older framework, the restorative framework. God is trying to restore things, including us, our human nature, and our relationships, and he calls us into partnership to do that. And this is why, again, we are thinking about how to restore the honor and dignity and power that God originally gave to women. And thirdly, we're concerned about scapegoating. Scapegoating is an interpersonal problem, and it's a political problem, especially here in the US. Some of you may know that back in 2016, I wrote a blog series on scapegoating and how that plays out in US politics. That concern continues. And the reason why it is a concern is because scapegoating is what people do or tend to do when they are shaped emotionally and formed spiritually in a framework where they think God's justice is retributive. They think, well, there must be some easy answer to our problems. There's some offender. So if I feel bad, I'm asking, then who made it this way? It must be someone's fault. And then I scapegoat someone or some community for the things that I feel. And we really want to take a serious look at that and to stand against it.
You see, man made.
So that system gets replaced by this very centralized, retributive system. And it's looking back to the Roman Empire as a guide. And the Roman Empire, may I remind you, is the empire under which Jesus was crucified. So that gives you kind of a taste of what their MO was. Justice is not about repair. It's not about putting things right. It's about protecting the purity of the state. not righting wrongs or restoring relationships.
Oh, yeah. And it's easy to see how gender plays into that. The relationship between the husband and wife, that's a mini empire. So women's punishment is kind of a symbol like a lynching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is definitely a symbolism component to it. And you see that in some stories more than others. One story where you see it really clearly is the story of Anna Pappenheimer. So, Anna Pappenheimer was living in Bavaria in the year 1600, and Duke Maximilian I had recently come into power just a few years before. Things were not going well for Duke Maximilian. He and his wife could not conceive, and there was a big increase in crime in the time that he took power. So he felt like he needed to do something to demonstrate, I'm still in charge, I still have the power. And he thought a good way to do that would be a witch trial. So he sends his men out to look for a witch. They come back and they say, we couldn't find any witches. And he actually sends them out again and says, no, you need to go find a witch. So they come back with Anna Pappenheimer, who is the wife of a privy cleaner. So she is about as low on the social hierarchy as you can get. They arrest her, her husband, and 2 of her children, and they basically torture them until they confess to all of these unsolved crimes. And they get them to say, yes, we did all these crimes and we used witchcraft to do it. So they are convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to be burned at the stake. We talked about how Europe is looking back to the Roman Empire, and that's definitely true in their execution methods as well. The Pappenheimer's execution was a very public, all-day event that had torture every step of the way. And Anna Pappenheimer's execution was especially symbolic. Before she was executed, she was put in front of the crowd, stripped, and her breasts were actually cut off before she's sent off to be burned at the stake. So there's definitely a symbolism component there where the audience is looking on and getting this message that this woman is dangerous, not just because of what she allegedly did, but because of what she is as a woman.
An all-day public execution event in which everybody watches. It is like a lynching, and you do have to wonder if at some point somebody in that crowd would have said, are we the bad guys here?
Yeah, you would think, but that is the power of the drama, because they have this narrative that they are telling themselves that these brutal, sadistic tortures that they are inflicting on these women, they're doing them a favor, because the whole point of this is so that they can confess and their souls can be saved.
When men define what protection of women looks like, they can convince themselves. Again, this is a psychologically intense, not real drama, that torturing and murdering women is actually protecting them, to mask the fact that you are actually literally murdering someone right at that moment.
You see, man-made.
Haley, we have talked a lot about how drama works, but how do you escape from that triangle if you are being cast as the persecutor?
When shame is being projected on you, think of it like an actual projector. It does not matter if you try and hit down the building with a wrecking ball. If there's a projector putting a projection on the building, the projection is still going to be there. If you don't want to feel the shame, you have to turn off the projector. And what that means is that if the community is finally able to hold the perpetrator accountable, if they can find the person who's actually doing it, then you can be supported by the community. The perpetrator has an opportunity to participate in restorative justice, and you can be nourished and bandaged up by the community, and you can move back into a place of restoration. There is no path to restoration without truth.
And I love that image of the projector, it's so helpful because I think a lot of victims often they almost victim blame themselves for feeling shame, like
Mhm.
I should just stop feeling shame. And it's not like that. If
Mhm.
shame is projected onto you, it's just like when something's projected on you from a projector. You didn't choose that. It just
Yeah.
happened to you. And the way forward is seeing that reality and understanding this is not a you problem.
Yeah. If you have been the victim of a shame projection on you, it is very important to understand that the person who has done it, taking responsibility, will not actually fix the wounds that you have. The way that trauma works is it etches itself deeply into your soul, into your psyche. And if you are still experiencing the fallout of this, you must seek professional help. You must seek the help of a licensed therapist who is trauma informed and can walk you through the steps to restoration because it is possible. So, how do we counter this all from the Bible?
So during the witch craze, men thought that they were engaged in some kind of a cosmic good against evil battle, and that the way that was going to play out is by them literally hunting down and murdering women. And we have seen throughout this episode that that dynamic is still in play. And I think that the biblical remedy to that is to go back to Genesis 3 and look more carefully at what's going on there. Because we have this narrative from Adam where he's saying evil came into the world because of this dysfunctional woman. But let's look at God's response to that. Does God let that narrative stand, or does he say, no, I'm correcting this narrative? So in Genesis 3:15, God says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So God is talking about a battle between good and evil here, but he certainly does not put woman on the side of evil, on the side of the serpent. He actually does the exact opposite. He moves Eve over to the side of good first. She is the first combatant against evil in this cosmic battle. And that means that everyone who joins the side of good from this point on is going to be, by default, on the woman's side. She is like the welcoming committee to the community of faith.
And that's not the story that patriarchy would tell. Patriarchy would make Adam to be the first one to move back to God's side. That's what chivalry says, right? Patriarchy set it up so that Eve would have to come over onto man's side if she wanted to join this battle against evil. But patriarchy isn't telling the real story. God is. He gets to decide. And to be clear, we're not saying that women never sin, or we're not saying that women never need to take responsibility for their actions. Rachel and I are both happily married. We know that women sin. That's real life. We're not talking about that.
Yeah. But I think there's a huge difference in taking responsibility for your sin as a human being, as a person, versus taking responsibility for evil coming into the world as a woman, or taking responsibility for sin generally as a sex, because that is not real repentance. That's actually agreeing with Adam's narrative and saying, yeah, it's really God's fault because he made me like this. He made me weak and gullible and vulnerable to Satan's temptations. He made me a snare for men. And that's not repenting. That's saying, God, it's your fault.
Well, if we talk about what happens with Adam for a second, since we're back to him, he doesn't look great so far. In the last episode, we called him a man of dust. And now we're talking about how he's blamed Eve. And then he blamed God too. Is he just lost?
I think that we actually see Adam's redemption in Genesis 3:20, because Adam, this is his last line in the whole Bible, actually. And he says that he's giving Eve a new name. He calls her Hava, which means life or living. And he names her this because she was going to be the mother of all living. And this is happening in a particular context. Adam has just heard God tell him that he is going to return to the dust. He's not going to experience eternal life. And he's now going to be a channel for death instead of a channel for life like he was supposed to be. But he has also heard God's word to the serpent and this promise that there's going to be a seed of the woman who is going to crush the serpent's head. So he knows that God has a plan to reverse what's happened here. Adam doesn't have all the information at this point. He doesn't know about Jesus. He doesn't know how all of this is going to happen, but he knows that somehow it has to do with the woman. And so he is willing to cross over and acknowledge that life is going to come through her, and he needs to kind of get on her side of the line if he's going to participate in this life that God's going to bring back.
Thanks for being with us today. If you're enjoying this, you may be wrestling with other questions like, is hell just a prison and God holds the keys? Should Christians just accept climate disasters and the suffering of the masses? Should Christians just dominate the public square? Have we inherited the most accurate version of the Christian faith? We tackle issues like these head on. If you want bread and butter resources, check out our Bible studies and evangelism tools and spiritual formation material. If you want answers to tough questions, check out Reconstruction. If you want to live out Christian restorative justice, check out A Long Repentance, or Plantation Capitalism versus Jesus' Jubilee Economy, or Abortion Policy in the U.S. You can find our content on our website, our YouTube channel, and on our asynchronous learning platform, or join a live class with one of our instructors. We want to connect with you, whether you're a believer or a skeptic.